US economic recovery remains tepid and downside risks have intensified. They are of two types. One is clearly external and comes from the current European situation and its potential deterioration. And the second is domestic and is really closely associated with, number one, the debt ceiling, and number two, the fiscal cliff.
That was Christine Lagarde, the director of the International Monetary Fund. She's been its leader for the last year, and it's been a tumultuous one. We're joined by Martin Edwards, associate professor of the John C. Whitehead School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. And let's talk about that first year for Ms. Lagarde. She's the first female, first non-economist to take the job. How's she doing?
Well, I think that clip shows some of the tensions in her role, that she was talking about the U.S., and so there's the IMF wants to talk tough with countries and suggest that they do things that countries don't want to do. However, it's hard to actually do that in practice, and if you look at the way that Europe is being handled, there are a lot of problems.
Certainly. Now, you mentioned Europe. She came in with the support of several of the 188 nations. Several of them supported her stance at taking a tougher role in reducing the dominance of Europe. Has she been able to do that?
Well, it's been a tricky issue. She inherited a lot of, obviously a lot of influence, and they lobbied for her to get on the board in the first place. But in practice, she's only very recently started talking tough with Merkel, and so I think that that's still very much a work in progress. That's kind of the big challenge for her in year two.
Getting Germany and Spain on board, so to speak. She seems to have a great sense of humor. She at one of the World Economic meetings, she whipped out her purse and says, and I'm here to pick up a bit of money for for the IMF. Does that go over well, you think?
I think she's incredibly charming personally, and the folks that talk about her talk about, they might not agree with her, but they find her professionally compelling just as a person and just in terms of her attitude. Which is really refreshing, because the field of international finance you always think of as folks that are very staid and stiff, and so the fact that she's is a little bit more freewheeling, I think, allows people to get more acclimated with her.
Talk about how she came up through the ranks. She's had an unusual background.
Well, she is a lawyer, okay, and so she went from being a lawyer in Chicago to the French government, where she became finance minister.
Right.
And then when Dominique Strauss-Kahn resigned, there was sort of the question about who's going to step in. And so the rest of the Europeans who had worked with her sort of gravitated to her as a logical choice. And that's also kind of not surprising, given that they wanted someone that they could talk to. And so that, in a sense, made perfect sense.
She's also worked to bring more women and minorities into the IMF staff.
Yes.
That's got to be a good thing.
No, undeniably. The fact that the staff looks more like the world that it works for is unquestionably a good thing.
Let's talk about what she's doing to bring in China and Brazil. There was an agreement signed, I believe, in 2010 to give China and Korea a greater influence, shall we say, with the IMF. How is she working to manage that?
Well, this is a bit of a tough issue, because the central issue is about voting rights at the IMF, and voting rights are proportioned based on the size of people's countries' economies. So emerging markets want more voice at the fund, and for that to happen, other countries have to agree to let that happen.
Exactly.
And so those reforms are a little halting, and I think she needs to talk tough with the U.S. and the rest of the European countries to get these reforms passed. Otherwise, emerging markets are going to go elsewhere.
You talk about the word surveillance. What does that mean, improving their surveillance?
Okay, that clip was from the discussion that just happened 2 days ago about the U.S.'s Article 4 proceedings. And what Article 4 is a section of the fund bylaws that says every year we're going to issue a report card about the state of your economy. So she was just reading our report card, and our marks aren't all that great.
Let me ask you about your predictions for what she has to do for the next year.
I think this is a challenge. I think that she needs to talk tough with the Europeans and, in a sense, get more wiggle room for Greece. she also needs to engage the emerging markets a whole lot more. Otherwise, they're going to take their money and go somewhere else.
All right, we'll see what happens.
All
Thanks
right.
for joining us. Always a pleasure.
Thank you
We'll
very
have you
much.
again soon.